just want to say you are such a great friend to writers. And it's a really lonely life, so thanks for getting us out. And thank you all for being here. So I want to just open by saying that the Skyscraper Museum might seem like a little bit of a weird fit. I mean, it seems kind of the antithesis to the story of the Bowery, which we associate with, low-rise structures. But you'll see in a minute why it's actually a really great context to talk about this. My book is a history of the Bowery, kind of a biography of the Bowery. I like taking places and treating them like people and, telling you their life stories. And my book starts in Dutch times and it ends in the present. And it was a really long writing journey. That's a very long span of years. The street offers up just so many stories, way too many to fit into the book. The Bowery, of course, was long associated with bums, flea-bag hotels, and despair. As I'm looking around, a lot of you surely remember that bad old Bowery.
We were bums.
Or maybe if you were hanging around there in the 70s and 80s, you were going to CBGBs and watching the whole punk scene take shape. But as you doubtless know, now gentrification has really been hitting the Bowery very, very hard. Let's start looking at a few pictures here. This is a stretch of the Bowery in 1939. It's the east side. You can see there's an address somewhere, 180 something.
185.
Yeah, okay.
Up top.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
and on wall 185.
Got it. Right, so this is the Bowery that some of you remember. And here's another shot of that stretch of the Bowery. This is, I believe this was taken around 1980. And there's this fabulous building there, this one right here, which one of the groups, there's a couple of grassroots groups down there that are fighting really, really hard to get buildings like this landmark. Anyway, they failed and it fell to the wrecking ball. And this is what's there now, the Citizen M Hotel, which got constructed very, very quickly, although the lot was purchased. It was 4 buildings, those that you just saw in the previous frame, right? Yes. And it got flipped several times, which often happens when developers move in. And then finally, they made a deal and borrowed enough money. And this is the tallest modular building, the tallest modular hotel in New York and maybe the world. Anyway, the point is, there it stands in what was once these 4 funky Bowery houses. So, as all these houses get demolished and longtime residents get pushed out in the process, a lot of community organizers down there are fighting back. And so are preservationists. For example, the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, which we were just talking about. They've got a pit bull of a guy down there named Andrew Berman, and he saved really a lot of buildings in New York. They're all concerned about overdevelopment along the Bowery. Now, there's an aesthetic piece to their argument against building structures like this. Their position being that the Bowery's old structures are being overwhelmed by the new skyscrapers. They're always talking about scale, and this is the wrong scale for the Bowery. It's a really tough battle that these little groups are fighting. In New York, real estate interests rule. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This push and pull of opposing interests makes for really interesting conflict. You know, conflict is the stuff of stories. So, you know, I have strong feelings about New York in all kinds of directions. You know, I'm not going to take one position here, but I do love conflict. So I love, you know, observing how this is being played out on this street, on the Bowery particularly. And it's an ongoing story. I've been watching this story for about, I would say, 6 years when I first started researching and writing this book. The fact is, there is very little restriction for building along the Bowery, and therefore it really is up for grabs by developers. There are landmark buildings here and there, for example, the Bowery Mission, and the entire district has been named a historic district by the National Park Service. And then there's a swath of the street that's along the border of Little Italy, that's part of the Little Italy Historic District, which I think is a designation by the city. But none of those designations actually protect structures. It simply limits their heights. So unless a building is actually landmarked by the Landmarks Commission, it's vulnerable. The city's position, and the city has made this very clear both directly and indirectly, is that the Bowery is a wide street, it's close to transportation, and therefore an appropriate location for tall structures. In other words, the city believes good riddance to the bad old Bowery. And you know, when I say the bad old Bowery, I'm thinking of images like this. This is from that movie On the Bowery by Lionel Bergosin. Has anyone seen this? Yeah, it's a classic of neorealism. It was made in 1957 when the L was coming down. Do you remember when this movie was made? Jack Eichenbaum here is a geographer, and he knows everything about New York. So ask him, not me, if you have any questions. You know, and he actually followed these bums around for 2 years and made a story. And they were not actors, you know, they were just guys living on the street.
It's like
and
a documentary.
I'm sorry?
It's a documentary.
Not exactly.
Because they use real people.
Well, let's stay on topic here. Anyway, you know, the city has always wrung its hands over the Bowery. You know, what should we do? How do we clean this place up? So the fact of the matter is, the Bowery was never all bad. And what I mean by that is its history is impossibly and wonderfully complex. I'll be telling you a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to say something here about the Bowery's architectural history. After all, this is the Skyscraper Museum. Because of the street's long-time raunchiness, its real estate was long undervalued. The result was that a lot of old, intrinsically interesting, and historically significant structures survived on the Bowery because nobody wanted to invest any money there. Such as 185 Bowery, the building in, sorry, this building right here. You know, it just stayed there because nobody bothered to knock it down until they recently built the Citizen M Hotel. The architectural historian Carrie Culhane, who wrote the report that resulted in the Bowery being designated a historic district by the Parks Department. And if you just, you know, you can find the report on the web if you're interested. It has a wonderful description of every building on the Bowery when she wrote the report, which is, I think, around 2000. A lot of these buildings are gone now. I'm going to just read you one paragraph because I think it explains a lot about why it was so, you know, these buildings mattered. She says, the Bowery, it extends from Chatham Square on the south to Cooper Square on the north. That's where the boundary is. And mixed use and commercial architecture dominate the district. intact 2.5 to 3-story Georgian and federal buildings built as townhouses, artisan workshops, as well as commercial and residential rental property reflect the early mixed-use real estate development patterns of the street in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These rare survivors of Lower Manhattan's early history stand interspersed among an extensive collection of 4 to 6-story Italianate, Neo-Grec, and Renaissance Revival lofts reflecting the Bowery's commercial and industrial history. The flexibility of the open loft plan accommodated a variety of other significant uses, including the many dime museums, concert saloons, and lodging houses that characterized the street from mid-19th into the mid-20th century. And then there were still are monumental bank buildings, these great Beaux-Arts structures that were built just around the turn of the last century. Unlike other neighborhoods and districts of Manhattan, which were typically developed within a short period of time, the Bowery developed over 4 centuries of Euro-American history, and its extant architectural heritage is a diverse catalog of architectural styles dating to every decade between 1780 and present. Throughout the length of the Bowery, there's no correlation between geography and age of building. The Bowery is uniformly irregular and therefore unique. So when people down there talk about what we're losing, I think it's important to remember why they're making that argument. And she sums it up very, very clearly in that paragraph. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about the history of the Bowery itself. As New York continues to cater to more and more to, the life that involves money, there's just more and more money coming into this city. People who write about New York, myself included, but other people like the elusive Jeremiah Moss, who has that website. I think he still writes on it. It's called Disappearing New York. And also Kevin Baker, he had an article in the Atlantic a couple of months ago about, and he called it The Death of a Great City. Mourn the passing of that gritty, dangerous New York that gave the city such edgy charm that a whole film genre developed here called noir, right? Which was epitomized by Weegee, the tabloid photographer, who famously rushed down to crime scenes before the police even got there. Did you know Weegee? Did you ever meet Weegee? You look like you should have. That New York of blessed memory, this New York, and that New York, with its cheap rents and shabby lunch counters, was an incubator for artists of all kinds. But here's the other side of the story, or actually another facet, because there's a lot of facets to this story. We have to be careful not to feel overly nostalgic for that New York. Nostalgia can be a trap, and those were pretty rough times. We all remember the urine-scented graffitied subways, the deserted streets at night, the muggings, the breathless wait for the city to default in the 1970s. But the Bowery was always far more than the country's most notorious Skid Row. The Bowery was all about immigrants. Now, let me give you some history in very capsule form. And if you want the complete version, just buy my book. I hope you like it. When the Dutch came here in 1626, they discovered a Native American path that began at Manhattan's southern tip and stretched all the way north. Within weeks, they were clearing the forests on either side of the path and turning the lots into farms, which in Dutch is Bowery, hence the name. The English took over New Amsterdam, renamed it New York, and wealthy merchants, Knickerbockers, built country homes along the Bowery, like this one. And by the way, this is the spot where that high-rise I just showed you. I'm sorry? This is I want to say it's before the American Revolution. Okay, so it's the 18th century. After the American Revolution, the Astor brothers, German immigrants who recently landed in America and were getting rich off the fur trade, yes, those Astors of the Astor Foundation, began buying up Bowery properties. They built small houses on the lots and rented them to the working classes. From then on, the Bowery was synonymous with the working class and the poor, which in New York is just another way to say immigrant. A thriving microeconomy developed along the Bowery to service the local population. There were all manner of small businesses: butchers, stationers, dry goods merchants, jewelers, grocers, and theaters. The first theater stood at what is now 48 Bowery. It's a squatty brown building that houses the Jim Fung restaurant, and it occupies a lot that goes all the way through to Elizabeth Street. And it's right next to that glass high-rise hotel. This was the Bowery Theatre, which was later renamed the Thalia. It was built by Henry Astor, and he built it to stick it to his older brother, John Jacob, who'd arrived in America first. John Jacob owned the only theater in New York at the time, the Park Theater, on what is now Park Row. And that theater catered to the Knickerbocker elite. Henry Astor had this great idea. He thought, why not, make a theater for all the poor people living around here? There's this whole untapped audience. Was there ever a more American, way of looking at, anything? Then how can I make money off this? So, he's thinking untapped market, untapped market. So he built this theater. It seated 3,000 people, and it was gas lit, which was really, oh, you want me to stand over here? Sorry, I just remembered. Which was really, very high tech in, what year was this? 1826. So the Bowery Theatre turned out to be wildly successful. All these great American actors, people like Edwin Forrest or Junius Brutus Booth, who was the father of Lincoln's assassin, they played Shakespeare in this theater for the masses. They played everything from Shakespeare to melodramas, and then another very popular form of entertainment was the Minstrel Show. This theater, featured all these different genres of theaters, and it was one of the favorite haunts of Walt Whitman. He reminisced just about how great the scene was in the New York Tribune. He wrote that, he described the crowds at the Bowery Theatre. Any good night at the old Bowery, it was packed from ceiling to pit with its audience of alert young, well-dressed, full-blooded, young and middle-aged men, the best average of American-born mechanics. The emotional nature of the whole mass, aroused by the power and magnetism of as mighty mimes as ever trod the stage. The whole crowded auditorium bursting forth into one of those long, kept-up tempests of hand-clapping peculiar to the Bowery. No dainty kid glove business, but electric force and muscle from perhaps 2,000 full-sinewed men. That's so Walt Whitman. All those men, yes. There never were audiences that paid a good actor or an interesting play the compliment of more sustained attention or quicker rapport. Okay. The Bowery Theatre's rip-roaring success led to more theaters popping up along the Bowery, and all the while immigration to New York just kept growing and growing and growing, and the playground for all these immigrants was the Bowery. You had all these different ethnic theaters along the Bowery, and it wasn't just one neighborhood. It ran through all these different enclaves of people in the slum neighborhoods that flanked each side of the thoroughfare. The Lower East Side, Mulberry Bend, the Five Points, there were first the English and the Irish, and then the Jews and the Italians arrived in the 1880s, and they pushed out the Irish and the Germans to neighborhoods further north. All these, and then there were Chinese, and there were African Americans who coexisted with the Irish in the Five Points. And all these folks hung out in the Bowery's theaters and saloons and dive bars. You know, what better fermenter of creativity than a bar? The Bowery was lined with saloons, theaters and saloons. I mean, this was the backbone of the Bowery. There were all manner of entertainment for the hoi polloi. Along with theater, you had dive bars and dance halls and concert saloons, and you had these really strange places called dime museums. They were kind of mini Barnum circuses, and they featured freak shows and rooms filled with bottles of preserved body parts and gigantic German beer gardens. You see this Atlantic Garden here. This was a huge German beer hall, and where it now, this is what stands on it now. This is a brand new hotel. It's called 50 Bowery, and it was constructed by third generation Chinese Americans whose grandfather had invested in Chinatown and the surrounding area. And in the last, it's interesting, there were, if you go below, I think it's, I want to say Hester Street, suddenly the Bowery is completely Asian. A lot of these properties, Chinese Americans have been holding on to these for years, and now they're getting cashed out because property is, of course, so outrageously valuable, I want to say. In the 1880s, let's go back here, the owner of the Atlantic Garden, a German, he bought the Bowery Theatre, and he began renting it out to Jews who were coming in droves from Tsarist Russia, and they turned it into a Yiddish theater. And at its height, there were 12 Yiddish theaters on the Lower East Side. There were 4 along the Bowery. Everyone thinks that Yiddish theater started on 2nd Avenue. Well, it didn't. It started on the Bowery. And why was that? Because space was cheap, you know. The Bowery was déclassé. And then when, you know, things got better, theaters moved over to 2nd Avenue. The Jews renamed the Bowery Theatre the Thalia, which is what it's called here. I think it's hard to make out,
Yeah.
but some of the actors who performed in these early Yiddish theaters have familiar names. Jacob Adler started a whole acting dynasty, and Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski have a grandson, and his name is Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor. So, you know, Yiddish theater started on the Bowery, and then it kind of transmuted into Broadway, and then it ultimately made its way to Los Angeles. What I mean here is popular culture, you know, popular American culture. It all started here. As the Jews moved on from the Lower East Side, the Thalia for a time housed Italian theater, and then Chinese productions. This theater burned down 5 times during its life. The last time it burned was in 1929, and that was the last time. It was never rebuilt, and it was forgotten. Nobody, I mean, I don't think there are a whole lot of people out there who realize that this really important institution once graced the Bowery. You know, the really hard times on the Bowery, this is a wonderful photo, an etching from Harper's. And it is from 1871, Saturday Night on the Bowery. This was really I want to say the heyday of the Bowery, when the Bowery was at its most vibrant, most crowded, most busy. When this whole microeconomy was just supporting itself with tiny little businesses and all these different forms of entertainment. It fell on hard times during Prohibition, because Prohibition was very, very hard on the bum population. The institution of the saloon was destroyed during Prohibition, and it made life very, very hard for the homeless people on the Bowery. From the 1930s to the 1980s, that 50-year stretch was when things really began to go downhill. In the 1970s, somebody named Hilly Crystal took this old dive bar right here and turned it into CBGB. And the really interesting thing about the punk movement on the Bowery was how it incorporated the surroundings into this outlier genre of music that really sprung up by accident at CB's. He had no intention of starting a new form of music. He actually was interested in country music, but people kind of found their way here, and it was a really dark time in New York in the late 70s. And voila, you got this one real sort of natural springing up of a new form of rock music. So, during the bad times, you had the bums and the artists living side by side, because artists always, that always happens with artists, right? They move to wherever they can find cheap space. But it wasn't just cheap space on the Bowery, it was also the ambiance. There was always art being created on the Bowery from the very beginning. There were so many famous artists and writers who lived there for some 150 years or more. I'm going to just mention a few in passing. For example, William Burroughs, Hetty Jones and her husband, Amiri Baraka. Hetty Jones still lives on the Bowery. Stephen Foster lived on the Bowery. He wrote a lot of his most famous music in a room, and he, lived on turnips. And there was no copyright law, and he died. He actually died in Bellevue, but he fell. No, actually, I think he died in his room. He fell and hit his head, and was taken to Bellevue, brought back to his room on the Bowery, and died there. Eva Hess, the sculptor, lived in a Bowery studio. The list is very, very long. There were also famous tattoo artists. There was always this fabulous tattoo culture down there. Did anyone see that exhibit at the New York Historical Society on tattoo artists last year? It was amazing. Here we are in the present, okay? And here we are with this. And, do millennials know that the Bowery was really where the New York vibe began? If you ask a millennial if they've ever heard of a Bowery bum, chances are they'll say no. But they've heard of a Bowery bar. But they're not talking about an old dive bar where the bums hang out. They're talking about some trendy wine bar, or someplace where you get those little craft beers, where they give you all the different flavors. And it's like, $25 a hit. So this brings us to the existential, question of, well, what do we do now? American popular culture was born on the Bowery. You know, I didn't make that up. I'm not the only one saying it. You know, it's true. But it's not very well known. And there's such an intrinsic paradox in that statement, because the Bowery, which is the most New Yorkiest street ever, the most immigrant street ever, you know, in rural America, New York, an immigrant from way back is synonymous with other, undesirable, criminal, you know, fill in the blanks. But the fact is, it was the most American street ever. You know, all these immigrants landing there, rubbing elbows, and creating art, which then got carried all over the place. You know, American popular culture. And by the way, not just all over America, but then back across the ocean. So now let's get back to and talk about skyscrapers. Skyscrapers along the Bowery. You know, you could argue that skyscrapers are just inevitable in New York. But on the other hand, who could argue about the need to keep the Bowery's history alive in New York's consciousness? I think we all want that. You know, it's such an important piece of New York history. It's like having your ancestors on the wall, you know, or like in Asian cultures where you have an altar with all your ancestors. You know, cities are really people, you know, and we need to honor them just like, you know, we honor human beings. I can tell you one thing, these forces of, opposing forces on the Bowery, the forces of real estate development and the forces of neighborhood groups, the desire for preservation will continue to struggle with each other very, very hard now and going forward. But, you know, that's just one of the 8 million stories in New York. And New York is always about conflict and about opposing forces. So I want to just read you one small passage from my book, and then I would like to open this up to Q&A. And if anybody has memories of the old Bowery, I really want to hear them. This is from my chapter, The Bums on the Bowery. In 1924, the World League Against Alcoholism issued a glossy 16-page pamphlet devoted entirely to the new dry Bowery. The saloon was the hub around which all vice revolved on the Bowery. Prohibition blasted it to smithereens, it bragged. But the ecstatic, do-gooders didn't give a thought to what prohibition meant for the bums. Saloons did not just offer booze, they satisfied many basic needs that were otherwise going unmet. During the day, the saloon was a place where you could sit around and schmooze. On cold, snowy nights, saloons were the, quote, only lighthouses for those wrecked mariners, so brilliant and so glowing that I did not wonder these homeless men were allured to shelter within. Bums had favorite spots where they hung out with their friends, and an owner looked out for them. They could leave their money with him, and he'd put it in a safe and keep it for them. Or he'd let them use his address like a post office box. If a bum got sick from alcohol poisoning, he headed over to the Alligator, a 5-cent a shot joint where the British-born Doc Sheffield, once a surgeon in a London hospital, whose nose was mapped with the tiny red veins that belie chronic alcoholism, had his office. Clad in a greasy frock coat and a shabby silk hat, the doctor cared for any bum who needed him. Some owners had a flop room at the back of their saloon, where they let drunken bums spend the night sprawled out on a sawdust-covered floor, or slumped in chairs, the spit dribbling out of their mouths. It wasn't much of a bet, but it beat sleeping in a doorway or on the sidewalk under the L, where you might get robbed or worse. Without saloons, the bums were lost. During the day, if they had a dime, they could sit and doze in one of the Bowery's cheap moving picture houses that now occupied some of the old theaters until somebody threw them out. Otherwise, they wandered the streets. All day, the bums patrolled the Bowery. They fill the vacuum in this region of inertia. They walk as on a tightrope, the razor edge of vacancy between the turbulence of the East Side and the racketing traffic of the warehouses, a New York Times reporter wrote in a 1924 story called The Street That Died Young, about the Bowery. Slowly, in draggled procession, they move from the Y on East 5th Street to the Salvation Army and down to the drinking fountain at the Branch Y. Not to go in, simply they follow herd-like as the crowd moves to stand and spit and watch the movement of the street. And then they go down for an afternoon on the benches of the Manhattan Bridge. Yes.
When did they erect the L?
The L was erected in the 1870s, and it was demolished well, they started demolishing it in the 40s, I believe, like after World War II, and finished in the late 50s. The Bowery was one of the last elevated tracks to be demolished.
Where did it go?
Everywhere.
No, the L.
You mean the Bowery?
No, the L.
Oh, where did the L go?
Yes. On West 3rd Avenue or where?
This was the 3rd Avenue L. Yes, the Bowery L was a line of the 3rd Avenue L. It was Park Row, where Park Row meets Chatham Square. It sort of loops around. That was where the transfer station was. If you go, there's a lot of pictures that people have posted on the internet. It was really amazing to see this kind of confluence of L tracks at that spot. And it really affected the quality of life of New York. Yes.
What is the oldest extant building now on
1799. And it's 134, 136 Bowery. It's two little federal houses that are not protected. The Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, one of the groups down there, has been fighting to get it landmarked for years. So far, nothing's happened. One developer bought those two houses and three next to them. The three next to them are gone and are now like an 8-story glassy structure. I think it's condos. But he hasn't touched the two, 134 and 136, and the reason is that there's an artist living there who's protected by the loft law. And I think he's just waiting for, yes, Jack.
I started engineering school at Cooper Union in 1959. At 16 years old, and was introduced to the Bowery, which I had never seen before. And coming out of the subway, I would be accosted by any number of bums on my way to class. And they would say, "Please, sir, just a penny."
Yeah.
That was on a Monday. By Friday, I had the guts to say, "Do you have change of a nickel?"
Did you ever feel threatened?
Nope. I have never felt, I am not a boxer or a taekwondo. I have never felt threatened in the city anytime.
No, but I mean specifically at,
No,
yeah.
I never felt threatened.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
I have a continuation of that kind of story. I worked while I was an undergraduate, I worked for the New York City Health Department for 2 summers. And this would have been in the early 60s. And I walked home, it was about a mile and a half, 2 miles. And I walked home in the evening, it was in the summer, so it was light out. And my path took me along the Bowery, it was the shortest way home. And I was inevitably accosted by people. I don't remember their asking for a specific sum. and I don't think it was, it would have been a penny. But in any case, my way of dealing with them was to say, oh my, I had learned this previously in, never mind, but anyway, oh my, how sweet of you to think of me. I couldn't possibly take any more of your time, but thank you so much. And I would send, they would run. They would decide that they were having the DTs, and they were imagining this small woman saying this to them. They just scattered in my path. And it happened, you know, 3 times, 4 times a week.
Yeah.
So if you have to deal with somebody like that, I recommend that.
Yes.
When did the Bowery first morph into Skid Row?
Well, it morphed gradually. It always was a magnet for homeless people. I want to say around the time of the Civil War is when it acquired that characteristic. Because New York was a hub, you know, all the soldiers went through New York, and all the business was going through New York, you know, everything was getting shipped out of New York. So think of all these veterans, you know, soldiers coming home or, you know, deserting, whatever, and they would just kind of end up wandering around, and they ended up in the Bowery. And, you know, when I was writing the book, I looked up Bum and to see when the earliest mention of it was. And it was actually, you know, I don't remember the exact date anymore, but it was longer ago than I had thought. I think it was around the 1870s. So in other words, Bum and Bowery were synonymous from pretty early on. But as I said, it became, the Bowery became, I want to say, grimmer after Prohibition and then the Depression. And then in the 50s, when, you know, so many white people were leaving New York, it was, you know, not getting it, let's say, not getting any better. And then what it really hit rock bottom, I would argue it was the 80s with crack.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happened with crack is that you got a different kind of homeless person. You didn't have like the kind of guys that met you when you came out of the subway and said, can I have a penny? You know, these were younger guys, they were more dangerous and more violent, and a lot of shelters were opened up, like former flophouses were being reused as shelters, and the city was trying to cope with all this homelessness, which by the way is even worse now, and all this crack. And so a lot of the old guys got scared away and they moved on and became homeless somewhere else. But so that bum culture really ended in the 80s. And then the development started to happen around 1990. Yes?
I don't know if you remember it, but on NPR Saturday edition,
Mm-hmm.
Scott Simon did a story about the sunshine.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
the thing that he talked about was this man.
Would you tell everybody what the sunshine was?
It was, where was it?
No, what is it? Because I don't think
It was like a flop, I mean, I don't know what you call
a
it.
flop house.
Yeah,
yeah,
but yeah, and the walls were partitions, not
Yeah.
really rooms.
sure.
And the story was about this fellow who weighed like 600 pounds,
Mhm.
and he couldn't ever leave because
Yeah.
he couldn't walk.
Uh-huh.
But they talked about how important the Sunshine Hotel, I think it was called,
Mhm.
was to these gentlemen
Yes.
who needed a place for a night to stay. And this guy was there permanently, but
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I talk about that in the book. You know, what happened was when development began, the flop houses began to disappear for obvious reasons. And now you have more homeless people in New York than ever. There are no more flophouses. And while it was not a perfect solution, it's better than nothing. And one of the organizations I spoke to when I was doing reporting on that subject told me that they were kind of trying to recreate that model in some of their, homeless, building. I mean, it's way behind. I mean, it's so far behind the need. But people are looking back and reassessing.
There's only one of those hotels left.
The Sunshine still exists, and the reason it still exists, I just walked by there yesterday. There are about 4 guys living there because they're protected by law. At some point, the law changed. You used to be able to just kick bums out whenever you wanted to, but you can't do that now. I think the law reads if you're there for a period of like a month, then you're considered a tenant, and it's virtually impossible for your landlord to get you out, So the Sunshine Hotel is still owned by the same family that's owned it for generations. They also own a big structure across the street called the Bowery Restaurant Company, and they would love to get rid of those guys and build, but they're not going. And I guess, the game in New York, of course, is, you offer to buy people out, whatever, but they're not going. I mean, I don't know the particulars of it, but
Right.
those are the basics.
But the whole restaurant supply
Yeah.
business has gone, as has the lighting industry.
It's definitely been thinned out, but it's not completely gone. I was just there yesterday, and I was sort of testing my assumptions. There's still plenty of restaurant supply places and a few, and lighting places too, and I think a lot of them are owned by Chinese, which is why they're still there, because they own the property. So, these things don't happen all at once, they sort of happen gradually. But you're right, I mean, the movement is definitely towards development. You had your hand
I
raised.
think she was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you kind of answered
Yeah.
my question about flophouses, but it kind of led into something
Yeah.
else. The Sunshine Hotel is still operating because of old laws.
Yes.
The value of the properties now are so high. How can that landowner afford to keep the Sunshine Hotel open when, it's a rent by night
How can they
or
pay the
weekly?
taxes?
Yeah, how is that possible that
I
they can
don't-
keep that open? Is it subsidized?
I have no idea. I've never spoken to him. This is all secondhand sources who told me. I mean, I've looked at property records. Yes, he is the owner. But running a flophouse empire, and there were several families that had like these empires, and some of them were actually well maintained. I think the Gatto family, a lot of them were Italian American from the neighboring, who owned them for generations, were supposed to have kept a pretty tight ship. And it was quite profitable. So, yes.
Yeah, my family started on the Lower East Side around the turn of the century, and we had my grandfather, my great-grandmother, grandfather, my grandfather had a business, Weiss Hardware, 169 Bowery, and Weiss, his business, he went into business in 1919. I don't know at what point he bought the building, but I mean, I have a lot of stories, but one cute one is my great-grandmother was Anna Yarmish, and she had this really long skirt. That's the way women dressed at the time. And she was working always behind the counter. And we used to have manufacturing upstairs, and I ultimately ran the manufacturing, which was moved to Brooklyn. That's another story. And all my family worked on the Bowery, years and years. But anyway, so my great-grandmother would go out on the street, and she would have scraps from our fabricating upstairs. We were making metal parts. So some of the scraps were like round little discs. So she would go out and offer she'd ask the bums to help schlep the steel upstairs to where the machines were. And then she would give them these scraps and they would be able to use them on the subway. So that's my story. You know, they'd be hanging out under the L, you know, and she would just go out there. She didn't speak any English, but you know,
And what year was this?
Well, I mean, they started in 1919, so I would imagine it was maybe in the 20s, 30s. And I used to work in the store, so I'm pretty familiar with that area. And my father actually sold the store in 1992 or 93. That's when he sold the store.
Did he? And I'm
So we
curious,
had it for all those years.
who bought it?
My father and I had a falling out, so, but the way I understand it is, he was one of the last Caucasian building owners on the block, on that particular block. You know, the Chinese would line up everything.
Yeah.
So some guy came to him with a an offer to pay him cash.
Mhm.
So he took the offer and he moved everything from the hardware store to the factory. We were in Sunset Park, Bush Terminal, where the factory ended up. They moved the factory in 1947 from the Bowery, and that's where my father started, working. My father was an engineer, and my grandfather, who was a greenhorn, he said, "Oh, my son's a genius. He can do anything, you know." So he ran the manufacturer. And it goes way back, a lot of stories.
Well, there's millions of stories like yours on there. You know, what's also interesting is the property turning over from one immigrant group to the next. You know.
Yeah, my grandfather's brother used to try and help out all the prostitutes on Delancey right around the corner. I mean, he got friendly with them, and they'd come into the store, and he would, help them out with this or that. You know, he was a mensch.
Is the building still there, or is it torn down?
One thing worth pointing out is
It's
where
still there.
Bowery ends,
Yeah.
It's a
which is
condominium.
at East 7th Street.
But as that building,
And that's where the colonial
It's the same
street
building,
pattern
but it's been
becomes the
renovated.
modern
Excuse me.
street pattern.
Excuse me, just,
And that's where the Bowery merges into 4th Avenue and 3rd Avenue. But also at East 7th Street, if you go west, there's a wall. There's a wall of buildings that separates the Bowery from Lafayette Street, where the richer people live.
right.
And you can't get through that wall except going up to Astor Place or going down to Bleecker
Yeah.
Street. And on the other side of that wall were the wealthy Astors who built the Astor Library, which later becomes the Public Theater, and the colonnades.
All those fabulous
Yeah.
colonies.
It's a tremendous downgrade of class there.
But I talk about this in the book. That boundary, actually, the Bowery originally was 4th Avenue. 4th Avenue became 4th Avenue in the 1850s after there was this riot, a 3-day riot in New York, usually referred to as the Shakespeare riots. Astor Place used to have a theater, the Astor Theater, where where the Cube is, the subway. There was this beautiful classical revival theater there, and the politics behind the riot are a little bit complicated, but it has to do with nativism, gangs, foreign, and American actors versus British actors, as a result, there were 2 actors playing Shakespeare at the same time. One was American and one was English, and so some demagogues whipped up the masses and got everybody out on the street, kind of like Trump does at these rallies, and a lot of people were killed in these riots. And so after the dust settled, and that, by the way, spelled the end of the Astor Theater, the people on the Upper Bowery, because they were the wealthy people, said, we don't want to live on the Bowery anymore. You know, the Bowery is really, has a terrible connotation. We want the name changed. And so they did get the name changed to 4th Avenue. That's why. You know. But it's interesting, over the years, merchants along the Bowery would periodically go to the city council and ask to get the name changed, because you know, the association of the Bowery was supposed to be so louche and so dirty and, you know, bad, and that's where all the good stuff happened, you know, that they claimed it's ruining our business, but it never happened. And then there were always people who would stand up and say, what, are you kidding? You know, if they rename the Bowery, you know, there's no reason to exist. You know, there's no reason for the street to exist because the association is just so powerful. Yes?
If the Bowery was name changed to 4th Avenue, why is the 3rd Avenue L on the same location?
Because it was part of the 3rd Avenue line.
I see.
Yeah. It wasn't actually 3rd, you know. The 3rd Avenue, that spot I was trying to describe to you at Park Row, you know, where Park Row meets Chatham Square, where all the lines converge. That was the 3rd Avenue. And there were about, I think, 3 branches. Is anybody here a Subway?
No, but we actually have copies of a self-published book on the 3rd Avenue L in the bookstore by a great, name of the author I forget, but a great aficionado and expert on 3rd Avenue L. So you can check the notes there or buy the book. Which seems like maybe a good cue to have the reception and further questioning of Alice, but also maybe buy the book. And thank Alice for a great tale. I will introduce myself. So I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And I'm supposed to stand here, as you're supposed to stand here too. So I'm happy to welcome you here tonight, and I hope you'll have time to look around the current exhibition when the talk is over, when we will have wine and water reception and also a book signing. I hope you'll be interested in purchasing Alice's book and getting a signature. Good for a Christmas present if you are anticipating that. Or Hanukkah tonight, you can start, you know, stocking up and move it along very quickly. This exhibition I'll promote a little bit for you. Is called Skyline, and it looks across the about 145 years of the history of the high-rise in New York. And for those of you who are here for the first time, that's what we do here at the Skyscraper Museum. We look at the past, present, and future of the skyscraper, not just in New York, but internationally. And we like to explore through research the forces that shape the skyline of New York. And you know, frankly, New York is always our favorite topic, as much as we like to look at, explore themes and other places. And our lecture series likes to also indulge as much as possible and whenever possible in the history of New York. And so our speaker tonight, Alice Alexiou, is one of the people who has burrowed into New York history in a lot of different holes around the city. And it really is, I think, urbanism that is as much the project of her storytelling as it is architecture, though her last book on the Flatiron building, she also gave a talk at here, and that was a biography of that building and a kind of pageant, really, of the glory of that building and the scene of New York, but also the cast of characters that created it. And Alice is joining the club of the three-peats at the Skyscraper Museum because her first book on Jane Jacobs and the title, Urban Visionary, is a book that she talked about for us in one of our very early, I think before we even had our permanent home here, and we've been here since 2004. So I'd like to say of those people, and there probably are maybe 5 people or so who've given a talk about 3 different books in their writing career at the Skyscraper Museum, that they are extraordinarily productive writers. But I now realize that I'm just stretching out the history myself. But Alice is a very productive writer because every 4 or 5 years she comes up with a new book. So The Devil's Mile, the rich, gritty history of the Bowery, this most recent production that came out this summer, is yet another dive into the story of New York. They're very kind of eclectic, and she uses the adjectives rich and gritty. Those things keep coming back, I think, to the milieus that you explore and that interest you. So I'm delighted to get out of the way and let Alice tell you about both the process and the product of her research on the Bowery.
Thanks, Carol.